We often think of monsters as lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. But what if the monster is someone we trust? Someone who gains control over our lives bit by bit until it's too late to escape. Today's story is about a young woman named Kelly Ann Bates, who, at just 17 years old, was manipulated and tortured by a man twice her age. A man she thought she loved. It's a disturbing case that highlights the dangers of abusive relationships, the warning signs that went unnoticed, and the horrifying outcome that could have been prevented. This is the tragic story of Kelly Ann Bates. Kelly Ann Bates was born on May 18, 1978, in Hattersley, England, to a loving family. She was described as a bright, lively girl who was well loved by everyone who knew her. Her parents, Margaret and Tommy Bates, were devoted to her, and she grew up surrounded by love and support. Kelly was known for her kindness, sense of humor, and love of sports. Her teachers and friends admired her, and by all accounts, she had a promising future ahead. But like many teenagers, Kelly was also headstrong and eager to assert her independence. This is how, at just 14 years old, she fell into the orbit of James Patterson Smith, a man who would ultimately become her killer. James Patterson Smith was 32 years old when he first met Kelly, and their relationship began innocuously enough, or so it seemed. Smith was charming at first, offering Kelly the attention and affection she craved as a young teenager. But beneath that charm lay a dark, violent personality. Smith had a history of abusive relationships, something that Kelly and her family wouldn't discover until it was far too late. Smith had a pattern. He targeted young, vulnerable women and systematically manipulated and isolated them from their friends and families. By the time Kelly's parents became aware of the relationship, she was already deeply under his influence. They were concerned about the significant age gap, but Kelly assured them she was happy. In reality, the manipulation had already begun. In cases like this, it's easy to wonder, why didn't Kelly just leave? Why didn't she see the warning signs? The truth is that Smith, like many abusers, was an expert in psychological manipulation. He knew how to gain control, to make Kelly feel dependent on him. And as time went on, the abuse escalated. As the relationship progressed, Smith became more controlling. Kelly, once outgoing and full of life, began to withdraw from her friends and family. Her parents, noticing the changes, tried to intervene. But Kelly, like many victims of abuse, defended Smith. She downplayed his behavior and assured her parents that things were fine. This is one of the most insidious aspects of abusive relationships. Abusers are often able to convince their victims that the abuse is normal, or that they somehow deserve it. Smith isolated Kelly from the people who loved her, making it harder for them to intervene. He took control of every aspect of her life, ensuring that she was completely dependent on him. By the time Kelly was 17, she had moved in with Smith, and her parents' worst fears were realized. Smith's abuse became more frequent and more severe. He began to control who Kelly saw, where she went, and what she did. He isolated her in his home, cutting her off from any outside help. What happened inside that house in the final weeks of Kelly's life is beyond disturbing. The evidence suggests that Smith's abuse escalated into unthinkable violence. In the months leading up to her death, Kelly was subjected to prolonged and unimaginable torture. Investigators would later discover over 150 separate injuries on her body, many of which were inflicted weeks or even months before her death. Kelly endured beatings, starvation, and various forms of torture. Smith would drown her in the bathtub and then resuscitate her, only to continue the abuse. He gouged out her eyes 3 weeks before her death, a detail so horrifying that it shocked even seasoned detectives. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case is that Kelly's suffering was prolonged, and she likely believed, until the very end, that she could survive. But in April 1996, Smith took her life in a final act of violence. On this day, James Patterson Smith walked into a police station and calmly reported that Kelly Ann Bates had drowned in the bathtub. He claimed it was an accident, but when police arrived at the scene, it was immediately clear that something far more sinister had taken place. The sheer brutality of the injuries shocked even veteran investigators. The level of violence inflicted on Kelly was extreme, far beyond what most had ever seen in domestic homicide cases. The autopsy revealed that Kelly had been tortured for weeks, perhaps even months, before her death. She had been stabbed, beaten, and mutilated. The details of her injuries were so horrific that during the trial, several jurors had to leave the courtroom because they were unable to cope with the evidence being presented. In November 1997, James Patterson Smith finally faced trial for the brutal murder of Kelly Ann Bates. Prosecutor Peter Openshaw QC laid out the horrifying details of Kelly's final months, explaining how Smith had isolated, manipulated, and tortured her. The jury was presented with evidence that shocked even the most experienced legal professionals. Kelly had endured more than 150 injuries, including multiple fractures and stab wounds. Dr. William Lawler, who conducted the post-mortem examination, told the court that it was one of the worst cases of abuse he had ever seen. The jury was visibly shaken by the evidence. Several had to leave the courtroom due to the graphic descriptions of her injuries. Smith, on the other hand, showed little remorse. His defense argued that Kelly's death was an accident, claiming she had provoked him. But the sheer brutality of the evidence, coupled with the pattern of abuse Smith had inflicted on his previous partners, made this claim implausible. The jury took just 1 hour to convict Smith of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the judge recommending that he should never be released. The judge described Smith's actions as sadistic beyond belief, condemning his treatment of Kelly as among the worst cases of domestic violence ever brought before the court. Kelly Ann Bates' case is not just about a single tragedy, it's a window into the wider issue of domestic abuse. What happened to Kelly is extreme, but the warning signs of abusive relationships are often subtle and overlooked. Smith didn't just control Kelly through violence. He manipulated her, isolated her from her family and friends, and made her feel trapped. It's important to recognize that domestic abuse isn't just physical. It can begin with emotional manipulation, controlling behavior, or isolation. These tactics make it difficult for victims to leave, often making them feel ashamed or convinced that they deserve the abuse. Kelly's story has since been a wake-up call to many. Her family has been vocal in raising awareness about domestic violence, encouraging people to intervene early if they suspect someone is at risk. They want Kelly's story to be a reminder of how important it is to recognize and respond to the signs of abuse before it escalates. Kelly Ann Bates' life was tragically cut short by a man who preyed on her vulnerability. But by sharing her story, we can honor her memory and work toward preventing future tragedies. If you or someone you know is in danger, please don't hesitate to reach out for help. There are people who care and resources that can provide safety. Thanks so much for watching. If you would like to see more of my videos, click here. And make sure to press this button to subscribe so you never miss an upload. Let me know which cases you'd like me to cover next. As always, take care. And remember,
I'm always watching.